Welcome to another edition of the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast. The legend Dino is in Rio. Been enjoying the Women's World Cup, have you, Tim, over that zone?
It's not easy in terms of time differences for us over here. We're talking today on the eve of Colombia's big game against Jamaica. For me, I'm going to have to get up at 5 in the morning to watch it after spending all night on the World Football phone-in with you and before going and do a two and a half hour program on Brazilian TV. So
My heart weeps for you, mate.
If I suddenly expire, someone will have to send me contact lenses back to my mum. But for the Colombians, it's 3 a.m. in the morning. You know, that's tough. You know, so it's not easy to follow it from and you know, if you do it night after night, you know, you're going to pay a price at some point.
Mate, for us Nigerians, as we're speaking just a few hours after England knocked us out of the World Cup, all we are asking.
Too late.
No, I know. That is our cry. But it's not too late to talk about an iconic game from the past of the football annals, as it were. And we're going to go way back on this edition of the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast to 1973. Now, if my memory serves me right, you were 8 years old, 7, 8 years old, 8 years old.
I was.
By the time game,
yeah,
8 years old.
Yeah.
Neck, mate, I would have smacked you around.
I'm sure. I have no doubt whatsoever
that
any
old.
kind of dinner money that I'd have taken to school would have been separated from.
You've clearly been reading my memoirs. I'm not proud of it, by the way. I'm just saying I would have smacked you around. Anyway, great to have the company once again of our resident academic from Leeds University, Dr. Peters, with us. Hello, mate.
Hello, guys. How you doing? Nice to be back.
Very well, Pete Watson. The last time we spoke, we had a real cracker of a conversation, actually, about, well, I suppose the sad times of Colombian football, perhaps the saddest time ever in Colombian football. Now, you've decided to go to Chile for what would be the most bizarre World Cup.
Well, if you thought Colombia in '94 was sad, you start getting into this one, you know, because I think what we're going to investigate now, for me, please, if anyone disagrees, let me know. This is the worst moment in the history of FIFA.
Yep.
And I think it's very, very telling that you won't find that much about it in the English media ever. At the time, subsequently, you know, all the anti-FIFA stuff, anti-this, anti-that. This, everyone involved in this, it almost makes me want to believe in a Christian concept of heaven and hell, because, you know, if there is a hell down below, there's a fair few people who will be there going through eternity. Mr. Pete Watson, sir, please explain.
Yeah, so I mean, the reason why I've picked this, and again, it's not just me being kind of searching back through misery after the kind of tragedy of 1993 and now going back to 1973, is that it's the 50th year anniversary of the coup by the Chilean General Pinochet against the left-wing president of Salvador Allende, democratically elected, albeit not on a majority vote. He only got 36% of the vote in 1970, but democratically elected. So we have this coup on September the 11th, kind of tragic day for many reasons. And the presidential palace is bombed, it's attacked. President Allende commits suicide. But the aftermath of this is that we see a kind of wave of political murders, of arbitrary detentions, of tortures, of disappearances. And many of these disappearances, torturing and killings actually take place in the National Football Stadium in Santiago. So the football stadium actually becomes effectively a concentration camp. And on the background of this particular event, of the coup, Chile is playing a crucial double kind of match World Cup qualifying against the Soviet Union. The first match is played in the Soviet Union on the 26th of September, only 2 weeks after the coup has taken place. And the second match will take place in the Estadio Nacional on the 21st of November, where all these political prisoners are being held. So this is the match, the fact that we have a kind of, a crucial World Cup qualifying match for Chile. We have the background of a military dictatorship toppling a socialist regime, and we have a match that therefore that represents a battle of, the communist ideology, left-wing ideology of the USSR against people who are virulently anti-communist, who are virulently anti-left-wing, and are busy killing, torturing, imprisoning people who are espousing that particular political ideology in Chile. So this is the kind of political context of this football match we're going to be talking about, or the football matches that we're going to be talking about today.
A couple of things from me. Well, the first one, the obvious one, I suppose, is why is the Soviet Union playing a World Cup qualifier versus Chile?
So it's a little bit like the repechage system that we still have. Chile had in that particular World Cup in 1974 for the qualifiers. There are 4 potential spaces for the South American teams. Brazil are already occupying one of those as the reigning world champions. And the way that the qualifying worked back then was that there were 3 groups, notionally of 3 teams. The winners of groups 1 and 2 would qualify automatically. They end up being Uruguay and Argentina. But the winners of the group 3 that comprised Chile, Peru, and Venezuela, although Venezuela actually didn't take part in the qualifying matches, would have to qualify against one of the winners of one of the European groups. And it turned out in this particular instance that USSR, who had been in a qualifying group with France and Ireland, had won that and therefore had to play off for the position. So this is why we've got a kind of representatives of the UEFA against representatives of CONMEBOL for that final qualifying place.
And you mentioned Salvador Allende, that this was during a climate of political upheaval in the whole region, really, South America, because Argentina, right across the border, is also had a military coup, and there are several military coups, CIA inspired, often enough, from what I understand. Yep. You said
the big one is Brazil.
Yeah,
Brazil.
And the vital one, the vital one for this story is Brazil in '64, because Brazil then becomes the base from which this is exported around the rest of the continent.
From which what is exported?
Right-wing military dictatorships, and this is extremely important to our story, because not only is this game significant as an absolute moral void from those who are running FIFA, there's another story here, which is this is the moment where Stanley Rouse stops being FIFA president. This is the consequence of what he did here. We'll get into this later on. It's a great opportunity for him, and he's just too idiotic to take it. And he is defeated a few months later by the Brazilian João Havelange. But this is the subject where Havelange was so vulnerable, and Rouse could have beat him. Rouse lost the support of the Soviet bloc as a result of allowing this game to go ahead, although the Soviet Union don't turn up. Now, as Peter said, this stadium is a concentration camp. There are thousands are held, thousands are tortured, hundreds are killed inside this stadium. The Soviet Union, they send a letter to FIFA saying, we're quite happy to play the game, but we're not playing it there. Now, whatever one thinks about the Soviet regime, they're absolutely right. And you cannot possibly, because, and this isn't a journalistic exaggeration, in order to play this game, in order to stage this game, honestly, they released some of the prisoners. Others were transferred into other detention centres for further atrocities, and they had to clean up the blood in order to stage the game. And FIFA sent a fact-finding mission to Santiago, and they're wandering around the stadium while there's prisoners up in the stands. And there's a fabulous film about this. It came out a few years ago.
Yep.
It's one of David Bowie's favourite films, actually, called Machuca. You see these events through the eyes of a child. And the bit towards the end where he's on a bus and you see someone reading a paper with a headline, FIFA declares that the situation in Chile is normal. And it's a symbol of the global betrayal.
And there's a documentary as well called Estadio Nacional by Carmen Luz Parot, which is probably one of the most powerful documentaries you'll ever see. It's unfortunate. I mean, I haven't found a copy with English subtitles. It's the kind of thing I'd love to show to all my friends and say, look, watch this. But what it does is that it takes people who were held in the stadium and tortured in the stadium back there, 20 odd years, 30 years after it happened. And they tell you the stories of what happened. And and you get these people who were tortured, showing you where they kind of carved their initials and the date of their detention into walls, the changing rooms. And you see them kind of descending from the stands or going through the gates into darkness. And it's almost like they're going back into the darkness of their memories. And there's so many incredibly powerful stories. And one of the things that is particularly almost humorous in a way, but it shows the kind of the way in which they kept their spirits up, is that they'd watch the people, the groundsman still mowing the lawn, for the potential football matches that were being played, and the lawnmower, he's sitting on this motorized lawnmower, and when they're approaching the goal, all of these detainees who are waiting to be called to be tortured potentially by the loud hailers in the stadium are starting to cheer, going, whoa, waiting for the lawnmower to get towards the goal. This is the kind of thing that they're doing. And then later, these people are forced to go back there. If they're football fans supporting their national team, supposedly, because Chile still played in the stadium, eventually they're going to go back potentially to the scene where they might be tortured. It's an incredibly powerful documentary. Going back to the FIFA visit that they organise, it's admitted by the head of the Chilean FA, a guy called Fluxar, that they hid the detainees in the kind of changing rooms under the ground, and they could watch them. They could watch them through little holes in the kind of these windows, kind of underneath, and they could see these. And they described them. They described them as these fat Europeans. There's a Swiss guy called, it's Helmut Kaiser, and there's a Brazilian called Abilio da Almeida, who are wandering around, for about 10 minutes, and all of these prisoners are watching them, but they can't say anything because the soldiers are there with the guns to their heads. And again, and Tim's absolutely right. Several weeks after this, they are cleared out. They're before the actual game we're gonna talk about shortly. They're cleared out. They go off to Chacabuco. Some of them are freed. Some of them go off to various other detention centres. But there were people there. Probably 7,000 people are in the stadium as FIFA are doing a cursory 10-minute inspection and come out saying, todo está tranquilo. It's a situation of complete tranquility. And the Brazilian representative, Abilio da Almeida, who again has been living under a kind of Brazilian military dictatorship, and I don't know fully his personal situation, but is probably at least a supporter, or at least is au fait with the military system, says to the Chilean authorities, look, we've had this pressure from Europe about human rights abuse and so on, but it'll go away. So just hold out, wait till it all dies down, and it'll all be fine. That's the kind of message that comes out from these FIFA representatives.
I remember being a kid, 8-year-old kid, buying Shoot magazine, and there was a page in Shoot magazine that was dedicated to global football. It was called Shooting Around the World. I used to love reading it, and I remember reading in Shoot because the Soviet Union didn't turn up for the game, and they're kicked out of the World Cup as a consequence. And remembering, this is absolutely right. The Soviet Union correctly and it's only in retrospect I think, what on earth? Where on earth was the moral compass of these people? Where on earth is the moral compass of the Chilean military? These so-called defenders of Christian Western values, who, and some of the things that they did to the people that they arrested. And there's one that you often see as someone who was tortured and killed in this stadium. It's not true. It's Victor Jara, who was a fabulous. He was mainly a theatre guy, but he became a singer-songwriter, and he was very, very associated with the AND regime. And he was killed in a different facility, not in the national stadium. But what they broke all the bones in his hand. You ain't going to play your guitar now, are you? You know, it just, how on earth could these people have lost their humanity to the extent? His widow, who's still with us, and she's not far off 100 now, is English, Joan Harder. I met her a few years ago, and she's really inspirational. She's really was pushing then. I think she's probably over the frail mark now. She's pushing for justice. They did find some of the military officers who were responsible for it. But she was fascinating to talk to, Joan, because she's written a great book. I think in English it's Unfinished Song, about the life of Victor Harder. And one of the things that she really stressed is that the left had no capacity to understand the depth of hatred coming from the right. The right wing seeing their precious hierarchies overturned, or not even overturned, or seeing their hierarchies weakened. And the absolute fury with which the forces of the far right set about what was a democratically elected and in some ways fairly mild regime. It's almost inconceivable, you know. It's one of those things that makes you fear for the future of humanity, to know that people are capable of that level of hatred. She told me something that was really interesting, because she fled Chile in the aftermath, as you kind of had to, if you could get out. It was hard to get out, but being English, she was able to. But after a decade or so, she went back, and she was a top dancer who then became a dance teacher. And the thing she said to me was, it was really striking the difference in the students who'd grown up during the era of Pinochet, because they were unable to work collectively. Everything was about their individual grade. Any kind of collective work was almost impossible. That was a fascinating conversation. That's one of the highlights, what I ludicrously call my career, sitting down and having a chance to talk to Joan Harder, who's still with us, not going to be with us forever. So what an opportunity this is to pay tribute to her work, both in her own right and for what she's done to keep the memory of her husband alive, Victor Harder.
Sorry, go on.
No, you
I
go.
was going to say that that there's a lot of the exiles of Pinochet actually came to Europe. There's quite a lot in Britain. At Leeds University, there's a mural, of solidarity with Chile. And there's again in Sheffield, I've seen, where I live, there are various groups of the Chilean diaspora who still, will raise awareness of the crimes and so on and so forth. And again, there are various, solidarity, groups in Britain who saw this. There's a film called Ne Passarán, They Will Not Pass, which I think is of Scottish dock workers. But the inhumanity of it is remarkable. There's a scene in the Estadio Nacional documentary of when various journalists actually managed to get access to the stadium, and there's a few of them are French, and we have a colonel in the Chilean army who is ostensibly controlling and trying to say, look, we're just processing, there's nothing wrong going here. And some of the French journalists shout questions to these people who are in the stands. They're just waiting in the stands. Like normal football fans, they say, are you being treated well? And they kind of say, yes, very cautiously. Are you communists? Is the next question. No, we're workers. Some of us are students. And then you have this bit where the journalists are, there's some of them asked for cigarettes, and you have this situation where the journalists are throwing cigarettes, and it's like they're monkeys in the zoo. They're kind of all desperate to get these cigarettes that are being thrown. And again, I mean, some of the other bits in the trying to survive in these conditions, there's a bit in the documentary of them having made dominoes with lolly sticks or with bits of paper, just in order, or with somehow trying to make little chess things in order to survive this kind of couple of months of inhumane treatment. And at any time, they might have been called to be tortured. There's a very famous He's called the Hooded Man, the Hombre Encapuchado del Estadio Nacional, the Hooded Man of the National Stadium. He was a former Socialist Party member who'd actually recently left the party due to some kind of ideological disputes of ownership before the coup happens. And he gets kind of enlisted by the army to come and signify who are the main kind of socialist communist leaders. So this man will be walking around with a hood, around the ground and pointing to people saying, him, 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 at any moment. And again, a couple of years later, this guy, I think his name was Juan Munoz, if I'm not mistaken, actually admits to being the hooded man of the National Stadium. But then a couple of days later, he's found kind of murdered in a dip somewhere. So there are these kind of horrific moments that are going on of kind of inhumanity and of cruelty and of fear. And it's all in this kind of venue where, so many kind of supposedly great, triumphant, exciting, happy memories of football victories are kind of...
And also
of
cultural festivals.
Absolutely.
The National was very important, not only for football. They had all kinds of... And the Andy regime sponsored a lot of kind of manifestations of popular culture. And there was a huge song movement coming out of Chile at that time. I never really like it, to be honest, or those kind of Andean pipe music, but that's their thing, get into it.
Simon and Garfunkel did well out of that.
Yeah, yes. I did the Copa America in Chile, 2015, and this really freaked me out. It was one night I was writing articles in my hotel, and the Wi-Fi went down. I didn't have any Wi-Fi, so I've written this article. I've got to send it. I can't send it. There's no Wi-Fi in a hotel, and I've been, when this happened before, I've been to local shops, but it's now wee small hours in the morning. There's nothing open. There's a hotel over the road. It's a military hotel, but I think I've got to send this article. So I go over and and they let me in. And the receptionist is really nice. Yeah, come in, use our Wi-Fi for 5 minutes to send your article. No worries, no problems. All right, what's the password? 11973. The password is the day of no, this hasn't gone away. Now, these forces of reaction, we saw them very, very clearly in Brazil, which really they're all about the preservation of hierarchy. That's what it's all about. And in Chile, it's also done in the guise of neoliberalism. There's a lot of the Chicago boys. It's a dress rehearsal, and an explicit dress rehearsal for Thatcherism. There are lots of connections, and it was seen as, look, there's no democracy. We can do what the fuck we want. And so it's a complete dress rehearsal for all of those ideas.
That's not Thatcherism, though, is it? That's not Thatcherism.
No. Yeah, there's
the economic model.
It is
the economic model.
Yes, the economic model. Turn everyone into petty bourgeois. Turn the entire society into unsecure jobs. Scrap the pension system. Privatize the education system. And the effect of all of this is they put it in the cloak of Thatcher. One of Thatcher's advisors, Alan Walters, had really he was going over there a lot.
Professor Alan Walters, as I recall,
and it was always look. Let's not say too much about this, because it's a bit dicey. The fact that it's a military government, but Cecil Parkinson went over there and said, "Yes, you are doing what we want to do, but it's easier for you because you don't have that nasty thing called democracy to get in the way." But it's all about the preservation of existing hierarchies. It comes in the guise of free competition and so on. But at the moment when you make education private, you're automatically excluding the poorer classes from it anyway, because they haven't got the money to go to your private universities. So these issues there, they haven't gone away. And one of the things that continually freaks me out about a lot of South American countries is the military budget. What are they doing, spending this amount of money? And what wars do they fight? They don't fight any wars. It's there to be used against their own population. That is the point of the entire operation, and that the kind of the kind of neoliberal efficiency. They never asked that question about the armed forces. Now, is it worth paying this huge portion of the national budget to the armed forces? Is it efficient? That the so-called proclaimers of market efficiency never ask that question about the armed forces, because they know what the game is. The game is preserving existing hierarchies.
Although you could argue that that's another way of talking about feudalism, South American feudalism. You know, because
it's a mixture. It's that mixture. South America is that mixture of semi-feudal and capitalist. But sometimes are the worst excesses of both.
What I can't understand with regards to this particular controversy, footballing controversy, everything else notwithstanding, but I can't understand why they simply didn't play this in another stadium. What was it? What was in it for?
Well,
FIFA or
the Chilean FA, knew that this wasn't on. They knew it. So there were people in the Chilean FA saying, "Well, we should do this somewhere else." The Chilean government, no, the Pinochet government, no, we're having it in a national stadium, because
why did they want
that?
Because
it's a declaration of normality.
Yeah,
but it's inconvenient for them, isn't it? It's really inconvenient for them that they have to transfer all these prisoners somewhere else and so on, and have to go through this sort of Samuel Becketin farce, as it were, to make it look as if there is an air of normality. I would have thought it would have been easier for them.
Yeah, I think you have to look at it as part of a kind of ideological war that's going on, you know. And again, I think that like Tim said, that the military forces in a lot of South America are seen as being guarantors of order. You know, you had it with the election in Brazil, you know, last year. You know, a lot of people wanted the military to intervene again because they're seen as being the people who will restore law and order. That's what they're there for. So this is kind of what the military supposedly stands for, you know, while they're kind of breaking all the laws and the order, you know, in these kind of military uprisings they do. But across the continent, you will always see the same. The military are law and order. If there's any kind of social chaos, please intervene. We don't mind if it's a dictatorship. A lot of people say that, and they will take over. So what you want, therefore, like Tim said, is a situation of normalcy. But also what you don't want to do is buckle to left-wing forces. So if you have the kind of the Soviet Union who are saying, we won't play this match in Chile because, you know, the blood of our of our kind of ideological comrades is spattered all over the changing room walls and so on and so forth, you're not going to buckle to that, because it would be seen as kind of caving into kind of left-wing demands, because there's a kind of Cold War ideology debate is going on. So, and what also happens is that a lot of the Chilean newspapers, like El Mercurio and various others, are making this part of a patriotic battle. So we won't accede to, you know, these kind of global powers, these European nations forcing us to play on their terrain. We've already gone and played in the Soviet Union. You know, this is the second leg we're talking about. Chile have gone to play the first leg in Moscow and have drawn 0-0. The last thing they want is to go and play in Germany, which is what the Soviet Union is suggesting. You know, they would lose this kind of chance to get to the World Cup. It would be seen as being Europe, you know, or global powers dictating to them what to do. It'd be a slur on national honor. It'd be a slur on the military dictatorship. You know, and again, you have this kind of this Europe versus Latin America idea where a lot of the South American nations are convinced that, you know, anytime Europe can, they will do whatever they can to favor their own nations. You know, so all these kind of ideological and patriotic battles are being fought to ensure that the game is played in Chile. I mean, Elias Figueroa, you know, the great Chilean centre-back, who unfortunately comes out as being a Pinochet supporter later on during the presidency, you know, is part of this thing. He's saying, no, we're not playing in Germany. We're not playing anywhere else. This is a Chilean team. It's a home match. This is the way the rules are done. You know, we're going to play in Chile. We've been and played there in this kind of totalitarian state. You know, equally human rights have taken place in the Soviet Union, although he's not admitting to any human rights abuses taking place in Chile. But, you know, there's this kind of battle going on. And this is why Chile, you know, the Chilean FA and the Chilean newspapers and so on are saying, no, this game has to be played in Santiago.
And I suppose to try and be fair, at this time, there's no other big capacity stadium in Chile. They don't have any. So, no. You know, they don't have many now, you know. But so I've always thought that Uruguay would have been the obvious place to stage this game. But as we're saying, Chile will not accept it, because in the eyes of those who've done the coup, and you still see this from the right-wing press today, they have protected the constitution against communist threat.
Of course.
And,
well, we remember,
you
don't we?
still see this language to this. This was big in Brazil during the last election. These issues haven't gone away.
We remember the way that Pinochet was welcomed after he had to flee from this country with the help of Mrs. Thatcher.
Yeah, and remember, she made it all about the Falklands. He gave help to her, but it wasn't. Well, it goes so much deeper, because the Thatcher project, the whole privatize everything thing, Chile was the prototype for that.
I was actually in Santiago when Pinochet was detained in Britain. I was kind of coaching sport on my year out from university there in a kind of school in Santiago. And, you know, there were protests of both sides. There were people who were supporting the detention of Pinochet, all the kind of, you know, the left wing. And again, this is, you know, 10 years after Pinochet's lost power in a plebiscite. You know, one of the few authoritarian leaders in South America to actually lose power in a vote, which is quite a remarkable thing. But you know, there's half people are there protesting in favour of Pinochet's detention. There are also quite a lot of people who are protesting against it, who are saying, what the hell are Britain doing? We're your allies. We helped you in the Falklands. You know, why are you arresting the guy that saved our nation from communism? And again, a lot of these people will point to the time machine and say, you know, 1973, when the coup takes place, this is a year of political turmoil, mass polarization, of food shortages, of strikes, of protests. You know, a lot of them kind of organized through the kind of center, the kind of center right-wing parties, far right-wing parties are kind of engaging these protests. But, you know, this is a country that is, you know, in considerable turmoil. There are a lot of problems going on. So that was the kind of climate that still exists, you know, or still existed, whatever it was, 10 years after the plebiscite with Pinochet, when Pinochet was detained in Great Britain.
I was in Chile at around that time. A few years later, I think, 2004, my first time there. And I remember being in one of the big bookshops in Santiago, and the books about recent history weren't in with the history books. They were hidden somewhere else, just hidden, not advertised at all, you know, because it's too controversial, you know. There's no way they can have a consensus on recent history, or could then. It's 19 years ago now. But I found that fascinating, because I went to the history section and was looking for nothing. And I went around and I found them hidden away hidden away, ashamed in a different part of the bookshop.
Yeah. Now, it may not seem consequential in regards to the match that we're talking about in November 1973. It may not seem consequential, but nevertheless, given that Salvador Allende had or saw the possibility of the national team being something of a unifying, a unifying symbol for the country, and inviting them into the presidential palace to, you know, for some kind of evening with Salvador to try and pass on his vision of a country united around football. Given that, what did the Pinochet regime think about football? What could they see the way that they could use football towards their own ends, Dr. Pete?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think actually probably in that particular year anyway, and probably, you know, in the years following that, when, you know, there are many fewer games that the national team are playing at that time. The team that actually becomes, I suppose, the center of attention for first the Allende government and then the Pinochet government is Colo Colo. You know, the great kind of Chilean, you know, they've won more titles than any other Chilean side.
And really identified with the Chilean nation.
Absolutely.
And the big chant that there is in the stadium is Colo Colo is Chile.
Yeah. And 1973 is so important because the Colo Colo team is a brilliant team, and they get to the final of the Copa Libertadores. Again, half of the Chilean national team is comprised of Colo-Colo players. The other half are probably Unión Española players, who actually also do win the Libertadores in a couple of years' time. But you have this situation where it seems like Colo-Colo, according to a couple of books that have been written about the 1973 team, is a team that actually delays the coup, because the only time where the nation stops protesting, or there aren't street riots going on, or whatever, or they're not worried about the lack of food or the queues for resources, whatever it is when Colo-Colo play. So Allende does use the national team. He invites them to the palace. He goes to Buenos Aires to watch one of the three finals against Independiente. So you have this situation first. Again, Colo-Colo will eventually lose that 1973 final against Independiente, and again, there's various controversies about that, which we can probably talk about as well. But then, following the Pinochet coup, in the years that follow that, whenever there are going to be organized protests, when the amount of military control is declining to some extent, there's a little bit more normalization, and there are economic problems arising from the neoliberal reforms that are being enacted by Pinochet Chicago boys. You do start to get protests on the streets. And whenever there's going to be an organized protest, because they had to ask for permission to do them effectively, they had to say, right, we're going to do this protest a particular day. It was amazing how many times Colo-Colo miraculously were involved in a game that had been organized, and often they were tournaments. In Chile, they were known jokingly as Copa Protestas, like the FA Cup. These were the protest cups, where Colo-Colo would play against maybe a team from somewhere in the north of the country, like Cobreloa, or maybe they'd invite a couple of foreign teams to play. So these were attempts by the Pinochet government to try to reduce the amount of people on the streets, to reduce the protest, to kind of hide these kind of public disturbances, and then be able to, flood the TV channels. And again, there aren't very many of them, or to flood the radio waves, or to be in the newspapers. Oh, look, Colo-Colo were playing against so and so, they won, blah 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 blah. It's the kind of old, bread and circuses kind of trick that football's been used for decades. So it is. It's. I mean, Colo-Colo, unfortunately, kind of before the coup, are they are used by Allende as they're on this Copa Libertadores run to be a unifying force that is somehow bringing the country together. And then after the coup, again, Colo-Colo are used by Pinochet, and again, Pinochet will become an honorary president of Colo-Colo. He will appoint certain military leaders to the board of Colo-Colo. So they kind of go both ways. And again, in other ways, football is used a great deal by the dictatorship. They create a lot of teams throughout the country. It used to be very much based in Valparaiso and Santiago, but various teams are created in the north and the south of the country to try and make the league a much more national one. And to the extent that Cobreloa, which is a team that didn't exist before, I can't remember the year, it might be 1975, I think they come into being. Several years after that, they're in the Copa Libertadores final. It's a remarkable achievement by them. But this is due to Pinochet trying to nationalize football, if you like, trying to bring more of the country into the league, to make the league feel much more of a Chilean endeavor. And there are lots of other kind of influences. Carlos Caselli, who I'm sure we'll get onto, one of the leading players of the Chilean team, and he was someone who had very pronounced left-wing tendencies as being a member of the Communist Youth when he was at university, is banned from playing for the Chilean national team after the 1974 World Cup for 5 or 6 years, for example. So there are lots of ways in which Pinochet will intervene in certain ways in order to make use of football at different moments.
But what about, Tim, ahead of this particular match? What about the players? They would have known, they would have been aware, would they not, of not just what General Pinochet and the junta had done to, or were doing to ordinary people. They would have been aware, would they not, of what was going on in this particular stadium. How do we explain their role in this match and everything around it?
Well, there's ideological divisions within the team as well. Peter's mentioned Figueroa. And Figueroa is a fabulous defender. He's the outstanding player. And his career stretches from the World Cup of 66 to the World Cup of 82. And at this point, he's been very successful in Uruguay, and he's playing in Brazil. And he could have easily gone to Europe. But he said, if I go to Brazil, this is how things were in the mid-70s. if I go to Brazil, number one, I can earn more money than Real Madrid, who wanted him. And number two, I'm up against a better class of player. It's just the different way that the forces were before the globalized game. So Figueroa is on the right. Caselli and Vélez, another one of the players, they're on the left. But most footballers keep their heads down, don't they? On football, it's like the military. You know, someone's got to pay them. So you know, you kind of keep your. The thing that's always depressed me about this is the role of the ordinary soldiers, the ordinary Chilean soldiers. And Victor Jara, the singer, he'd identified this as a problem, and he'd crafted songs to speak to the ordinary soldiers. Look, don't turn your guns on your own brothers and sisters. You know? And I always think it's such a. Through talking about this, I've come into contacts with people who are the kids of army officers who refused to go along with this and suffered consequences as a result. I think they are genuine heroes, but far too many of the soldiers and far too many of the footballers kept their heads down, which is probably what anyone,
well,
you know, what most people would do.
Although, Dr. Pete, when you see the short video footage of this match, the players aren't keeping their heads down.
This is something we do have to mention because we haven't done it yet. The game
right,
does happen.
Yeah,
only with one
does
side.
Happen. Well, yeah. We'll talk about the walkover, as it were, but they're not keeping their heads down. It almost initially, and there's only literally about 2 minutes of footage of this match because
that only 2 minutes of the game.
There was
only half a minute.
In fact, if it's up to a minute, but they don't seem to be keeping their head down. I mean, some of them might be a little bit embarrassed. I can imagine that they're completely embarrassed about not facing an opposition at all, but they're in this near empty stadium and they seem to be sort of giving.
Well, they sold a fair few tickets. You know,
yeah,
there's a crowd in there.
Yeah, there's 15,000 there. What kind of happens is that there's a few things to add to kind of what Tim's answer was, is that when it first happened, you know, they are due to travel to the Soviet Union on the 11th when the coup happens. A few of them will try to get to where they were supposed to meet. And then everyone kind of keeps their heads down because they're not sure what's going on. But remember, there's a kind of press blackout. So they're not really sure. Now, they are on the first flight to Moscow, the first flight out of the country on the 18th of September, a week after the coup has happened. That's the first flight out of the country. They haven't really had the information. They're aware of what might be going on. But it's not like the Chilean news are reporting that, oh, you know, we're busy killing all these people in the stadiums. That's not what's going on. It's not until they actually are traveling to Moscow and they kind of have a couple of stops en route where they start to find out what's going on. But they're banned from really talking about it at all. They're not allowed to talk to anyone. And again, you can imagine that, you know, they don't speak Russian. You know, they don't know really what's going on in Moscow when they're there, and they stay there quite a while. When they come back, they start to be more aware of what's going on, and a few of the players do actually kind of raise their heads. You know, one of them is Leonardo Vélez, who Tim's already mentioned, who again is a left-wing sympathizer. His uncle was one of the people who'd been detained, and he goes along to the Estadio Nacional wearing his Colo-Colo shirt. And, you know, and manages to ask one of the guards, says, you know, I'm looking for my uncle, look who I am, you know, and eventually the uncle is released. And the other person who raised his head is a guy called Francisco Chamaco Valdés, who is the person that will eventually score the goal, inverted commas, in the match that's played. Chamaco Valdés, who is probably one of Chile's greatest players, you know, again, not well known really out of Chile, we'll find out that Hugo Lepe, who was one of the heroes of the 1962 World Cup team, and who became a trade union leader of the Professional Footballers Union, has been detained. And Chamaco Valdés goes along several times to the stadium before the match is played against the Soviet Union to find out what's happened to him. And eventually Hugo Lepe is released. And there's a doctor, I think, who would kind of help the national team in various occasions. So a few of the players, you know, did raise their heads. But as Tim said, and as Carlos Caselli, again, has said on many occasions, he's been interviewed a lot about this. And Carlos Caselli is one of the great, you know, it's a very personal, very charismatic person. He will say, no, we never talked about politics in the change group. It just wasn't talked about. You know, when we went to visit Allende, it was just because he was the president, and presidents had to support the national team. That's what they did. We never felt like we were supporting, you know, the left wing or the Unidad Popular at that particular time. It's just what we had to do. And again, quite a few other footballers have said the same thing. And again, he just reiterates time and time again, we did not talk about politics. We did not talk about what was going on. Our job was to play football. Our job in some ways was to try and provide, you know, happiness for the country. And again, when, you know, Casali says that he found it a very weird experience, and Chamaco Valdez has said the same thing when they played that at that particular game, you know, the game where they're playing in front of 15,000 people and no opposition. And he said, and eventually after that, when they play again, he always says, well, we felt like we were playing for the people who are ghosts of that ground, the people who are suffering. So every time we played there, we're playing for those ghosts, those memories, those things that were there. We're aware of it, but we're trying to reconfigure, to restore what the ground should be there for. But I mean, the game itself, you know, it lasts for 30 seconds. You know, the Soviets don't turn up. There's about, I don't know, 6 passes, 4 forwards are kind of advancing slowly, jogging along the pitch, just kind of passing it sideways. You know, I mean, there's probably a call for offside at some point potentially. And then eventually Chamaco Valdez is, you know, just probably inside the penalty area. Everyone thinks, God, let's stop this. Just gets it, you know, dribbles a little bit further forward, and then absolutely belts it into the net, you know, traditional fashion from about a yard out. And then the game ends. What happens after that is that they have arranged another game. So they actually do play against Santos. Pele isn't there. Pele's injured, so they're playing against a Pele-less Santos. And they get absolutely thrashed 5-0. So it's this weird day of the disgrace of the match of shame where they win 1-0 and eventually they're given a 2-0 walkover victory. And then eventually the 15,000 people that are there watch them get thrashed by Santos. So a club side.
How do you explain that one, Tim? How come Santos went up to play in this infamous stadium?
Well, firstly, it's the Brazilian military dictatorship. You know, you do what you're told to do. And secondly, Santos were fantastic.
Even Pele?
Oh, God, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of quotes from Pele about being in favour of the military dictatorship at the time. When the military dictatorship in Brazil was far, far softer than what happened in Argentina or what happened in Chile. And that they have a less developed trade union movement to take on. So it did have, and when it took power in '64, it had considerable political support. And the years, late '60s, early '70s, were the years of the economic miracle. Now, when Brazil is growing at 10% a year, and Brazil is at that point seeing itself as a technocratic country of the future. It's always doomed to failure because they're not spreading the wealth enough to have a self-perpetuating boom. But that's important. Brazil's boom is important because I know I'm probably one of the only people who's interested in this, but it does fascinate me. The geopolitics around Rouse and Havelange, and Havelange winning in '74, which changes football. South America, or the strength of South American football, is a South Cone. And it's very, very European, especially in its elites. You know, and when we go back to this time, late '60s, early '70s, those people there, and Havelange's father was born in Belgium. But many of the people in high positions they're still kind of recent immigrants. You know, and Macri, the fellow who was president of Boca Juniors and of Argentina, his family didn't immigrate from Italy until after the Second World War. You know, so the whole one nation, one vote thing in FIFA scares South America even more than it scares Europe. And at this point, until late '60s, South America sees itself, the South Cone, as in football terms, as very much part of the, you know, we together with Europe, we are the nations of football. And they're really scared by the decolonial process, creating more nations in Asia and Africa, South America. Even after the '66 World Cup, there are many in South America positioning themselves against one nation, one vote, and for a kind of technical excellence between a bond between Europe and South America that's going to keep out Asia and Africa. Third worldism starts to come in. Some of it is a Chinese idea. You know, the first world is a superpowers. The second world is the other developed nations, and the third world is Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And this is an ideology that hits hard with the grandchildren of the European immigrants and the great-grandchildren who don't see themselves as European anymore. They see themselves as victims of Europe, as victims of colonization rather than descendants of colonizers. So the geopolitics here is fascinating as people are looking for votes. One of Rous's big, and probably the area where he's politically strongest, is capitalist Asia. It's Southeast Asia. He's even stronger there than he is in Europe, because there are many in Europe who don't want who are terrified by one nation, one vote. And the Belgian fellow who's a big executive, he's arguing late 60s, early 70s that UEFA should break away from FIFA and just go, we don't need Asia and Africa. We don't need it. So to some extent, there's almost an agreement between Europe and South America about this issue, and then Havelange takes it in other directions. And Havelange's selling point is Brazil's economic miracle. And Havelange organizes a tournament in 1972, a mini World Cup, where they get anyone that they can comes over. They bring teams from, and the Soviet Union went, actually. They bring teams in from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, and it's part of the Havelange campaign. And what Havelange is selling is Brazilian technocratic development. And this is argued explicit because Havelange's big ally in this is Pelé. And it's almost like a symbiotic relationship. Havelange is continually referred to as the blonde Pelé. And what this is a model for global development, in that you have the technocratic elite, as exemplified by Havelange, leading and unlocking the talent of the people as represented by Pelé. So now Havelange is starting to look out to Africa and Asia. And there's a couple of battlegrounds. One is China. Is communist China going to be admitted into FIFA? Havelange breaks with the Brazilian government on this one. So Havelange says, yes, bring in communist China. The Brazilian government disagree, but he's got some wiggle room on that one. Rouse is anti the entry of China, which breaks with the policy of the British government. The British government are quite in favour, but Rouse is playing to his constituency in capitalist Southeast Asia, who are against. So here Rouse is being ultra pragmatic. Two issues where he's not ultra pragmatic. One is South Africa, and Rouse fights to the end for the admission or the non-expulsion of apartheid South Africa. And for him, and he makes this quite clear, it's a matter of principle not to kick out South Africa. And that obviously loses him, or makes him very vulnerable to lose lots and lots of votes in Africa, which is where Havelange, with one or two businessmen on his side, focus their campaign to try and get Africa in. So that's one battleground. The other battleground is this game in Santiago. And this is where Havelange is so vulnerable, because on this issue, Havelange cannot disagree with the Brazilian government. Can't do it. He has no wiggle room. So on this issue, Havelange has to back up the Pinochet regime. Rouse had such a, quite apart from the moral question, he had such a political opportunity there. And it's where he loses the votes of the Soviet bloc, who vote neutral in the first round, and then it's obvious that Havelange is going to win, so that they come in with Havelange the second time around. Why? Again, I think for Rouse, it's a question of absolutely twisted principle. Now, what he would say, I think, was politics shouldn't be a part of football. But would he have played a game in Auschwitz in August of 1945? No. Would he really? Can you be that morally bankrupt? So that the whole geopolitical thing is fascinating, and it gets more so with the election, because Havelange wins, and Rouse writes a letter to someone on the International Olympic Committee, and he says, "Black power." He puts black power in inverted commas. Black power, bribery, and corruption have taken over our Congress. Isn't that vocabulary fascinating? Our Congress. It belongs to us. It doesn't. Not these black power people. The bribery and corruption. What he's referring to there now, obviously, later on in the Havelange regime, there's massive corruption. It's all based on kind of personal relations. It's a very kind of South American way of doing business through personal relations. But no one has found real bribery and corruption. Then what they're referring to is that the Havelange campaign pays the travel costs of the delegates to the FIFA Congress, because FIFA wouldn't pay them. It's one of the things that Havelange FIFA starts doing, paying the travel costs of people from poorer nations. Because one nation, one vote doesn't mean very much if you can't get there to vote. And that was the way that, quite cynically, the Rouse FIFA tried to neutralize the power of one nation, one vote. Oh, well, you can't come here, you can't vote. And so that I find that language, that our Congress has been taken over by black power, bribery, and corruption. I find that very, very evocative of a man whose traditional hierarchies are and the Rouse thing is fascinating, because right from the 40s, he sees that the British Empire is toast. So he's thinking, how can we retain British influence in the world? And one of the ways that we do this is through sporting connections. It's like a footballing version of the British Commonwealth, if you like. The way that Britain it's a kind of global Britain vision that Rouse has, where there is a kind of hierarchy there, where the leading nations like Britain help the advancement of the poorer nations. Probably there may well be some sincerity in it, but in practice, it always becomes a kind of maintenance of those hierarchies between the leading nations, who are always in a leading position, and the subservient nations, who are always in a subservient position. So that the whole geopolitics behind that in the 74 election, I find absolutely fascinating. You got any thoughts on that, Pete?
I was going to say the thing that really interests me is not just the hierarchies that are there in the global game, which I think you've explained really well, but also the hierarchies that are present within South America as a whole. I think we think about the likes of Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, who are looking very much to Europe for their inspiration, to see themselves as part of it. They also are, I suppose, looking down on the rest of the continent. And Chile are part of this. Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia. They're not part of this European ideal of what these nations aspire to be. Chile sees itself as more European as most, but there's certainly a chip on certainly on their shoulders. I think one of the things that occurs with the Colo-Colo situation in the Copa Libertadores, which is associated with these kind of hierarchies and powers, is that Chile often talks about the Mafia del Atlantic, or the Mafia of the Atlantic, of the footballing powers of Argentina and Brazil particularly, but also Uruguay, that are seeking to prevent other nations from having any power or dominance. And this is in national football, but also in club football. So the amount of times where Chilean teams, Peruvian teams, Colombian teams suddenly find they're playing against a Uruguayan team, a Brazilian team, an Argentinian team, and mysteriously the referee seems to be giving many more decisions towards the powerful team. It seems to be too often to kind of bear fruit. And again, I mentioned earlier about the Colo-Colo run to the Copa Libertadores final. In the final 3 games themselves, because there's traditionally a 2-leg final, but both are drawn, so they go to a 3rd leg. But in the first game, where Colo Colo playing Independiente and they're playing in Argentina, Colo Colo have taken the lead. There's been an own goal from Francisco Sá, but then the goal that Independiente equalised with is one of the most blatant examples you'll see of a forward barging the goalkeeper into the net. You know, there's a kind of a misplaced clearance that kind of the ball's floating in the air above the goal line, and the Argentine forward literally shoulder barges Neff, the Chilean goalkeeper, into the goal with the ball. You know, it's one of the most blatant barges you'll see, but the goal is given. In the second leg, which is played in Chile, again, there is a cross from the left wing. It arrives at Carlos Casale, who scores it. You know, the referee is blown for offside. He actually blows before Casale scores it. But again, every slow motion you'll see, Casale is miles onside when the ball is crossed. It's almost like there's a predetermined decision to say, oh, it looks offside, let's give it offside because we can't possibly have the Argentinian side losing. So Casale, Chamaco Valdez, all the various players of Colo Colo are completely convinced that there is the Mafia del Atlántico is interfering in this, and still say this to the extent that in the third game, Leonel Herrera, who is the Chilean midfielder, actually says, look, you know, we're playing the third game's in Montevideo, I think, and he says, look, we're staying in the same hotel as the referee. Let's pay him off. And he admits this on film. You know, there's a documentary called Sabor a Victoria where he says, yeah, I said, well, you know, we're going to be up against the referees. You know, they've already, you know, cost us 2 games. So let's pay him. We're staying on the same floor as him. Let's pay him, and we'll get the money back for winning the Copa Libertadores. And he says this to the Colo Colo president, who is nicknamed Don Aladino, Don Aladdin, because he owns a lamp factory, which is I love that detail. And, you know, this president says, no, we're going to try and win it fair and square because we can. And again, eventually Independiente will win this. But, you know, for a generation of Colo Colo players, of Chileans, of fans, you know, they are completely convinced that the Mafia of the Atlantic, which is composed of, you know, the white Europeanized South American nations as they see themselves, is intent on preventing any other nations and any of their club sides from actually doing well at all in any possible way. So yeah, so I think these kind of power bases and these hierarchies are just such a fascinating thing about South American football.
Yeah, as W.H. Auden reminds us, whilst some calamity is going on in one part of the world, this is in Musée des Beaux-Arts for those who are interested, as Icarus falls out of the sky into the ocean below him, life is continuing almost as normal everywhere else. You know, at one point, I think Musée des Beaux-Arts, as Icarus is splashing into the water, a horse is scratching its behind on a tree, for example, and a farmer is ploughing his corn, and some children are on ice skates skating about the place. The reason why I say this is because always on the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast, as you will know by now, Dr. Peter, we look at not just the football match.
Just one last word on the football, because Chile, in the end, in the World Cup, they might as well have been that horse scratching its behind on a tree, because they didn't make a great deal of impression. No. 1-0 defeat to West Germany, and then draws against East Germany and Australia. So after all of this fuss, it was much ado about not very much in the end.
Although not, I would have thought for the regime, it wasn't much to do about nothing, Dr. Peter.
No, I mean, the problem is that, you know, the one left wing, the very famous left wing player in that particular Chilean national team, Carlos Casale, who was someone who refused to shake Pinochet's hand before they went off. He managed to be the first person ever shown a red card in the West Germany game in that World Cup, and he got blamed for kind of, you know, ruining Chile's potential deliberately as being a communist sympathizer. So, you know, yeah, one of the kind of great football heroes who stood up to dictatorships almost, you know, ruined Chile's chance of doing that well. And then in the 1982 World Cup, when he did get back in the national team, he managed to miss a penalty in those World Cup finals as well. So it's one of those terrible things that, you know, one of the bravest kind of footballers you might get who stood up to a dictator, you know, probably, you know, had 2 disastrous World Cup experiences.
well, stood up to a dictator and didn't defect,
Yeah.
because arguably, like you said earlier on, a lot of the people
Well,
that
he did
escaped
go to Spain. He
Yeah.
went off.
afterwards,
Yeah,
okay.
he went off
Well,
Yeah, yeah.
to Spain in '73.
I remember the first Chilean I ever met was at university in Sweden, in Stockholm, and
Loads went to Sweden. Lots
a
of them
lot
went.
of them
Yeah,
went
yeah.
to Sweden. Yeah, and the guy was like a bank manager, and I remember him so well because it was only then that I realized that Chileans couldn't distinguish between a V and a B. There's a November, kind of thing. Which, and I don't mean that disrespectfully at all.
I
The guy was
remember
extremely nice.
a big sign in Spain in the early '90s for the English band Transvision Bamp.
And look where they are now. They should have chosen a better name, obviously. No, we always look at the soundtrack to accompany the times that we talk about. So we've had the iconic match, Mad as it is, and I think we've had the circumstances around that actually, quite thoroughly talked about. But the soundtrack of the time, like I say, you wouldn't know that there was all this political and social upheaval going on.
Bizarre, isn't it?
Well, in today's terms, it would be actually, because immediately you'd have people joining up together to boycott. Nothing like that could ever happen today. Nothing like that, because FIFA wouldn't be able to hide in whatever sort of corner of the universe they kept their heads down with regards to this. They wouldn't be able to. Social media would see to that very quickly. But needs must, let's look at the charts of the day. So we're talking about the match on the 21st of November 1973. At number one is somebody who, well, you feel free to talk about him if you want, but he's been cancelled. Gary Glitter with I Love You, Love Me, Love, which was just a soporific sort of meme on his own meme of rock and roll. I think, by now he's getting, he's getting into the kiddie fiddling, I would have thought. And I apologize for putting it that way. I don't know how else to describe it. Let Me In by the Osmonds, again soporific in my view.
Well, there's a whole juvenile thing that hangs over this, isn't it? Because we've seen that change from the late '60s, where this is a product of economics. It's a product of the record buying public getting younger and younger and younger during the '60s, and then by the late '60s, having a hit single is just seemed like a toilet seat around your neck. And the thing that broke up the Small Faces really was here we all are sitting on a rainbow. Hello, Mrs. Jones, how's your little bird's lumbago? Mustn't grumble. It was a hit single. It was a great record, but seen as teeny bop. So from that point, the rock bands who were regarding themselves as serious artists, they go into the countryside to get their heads together. They don't want to know singles. They are albums bands. And that leaves the road free. There's two types of thing going on, maybe three types of thing going on here. One is
four, but go on.
Yeah, one is music for the kids, like the Osmonds and David Cassidy and so on. I was 8. I remember this chart so vivid. I remember watching Top of the Pops. I remember the girls at school being into David Cassidy and that.
Oh, you had girls at your school?
Yes.
Oh, that's
yes.
Well, yes.
Yeah. What a difference that's made to our respective outlooks.
Exactly.
So that's one thing that's happening. Another thing that's happening is kind of 50s rock and roll nostalgia.
Yeah.
Alvin
Absolutely.
Stardust and the way he held his microphone.
Hey, this was his first track. I'm coming to that soon. Okay, trust me.
Another thing that's happening is there's a kind of feeling of afterwards. So people who were big singles artists in the 60s, like Macca and Ringo Starr, they're still cranking it out, or
Max Bygraves,
or the Motown stuff. There's one record. I think there's only one record for me that sounds modern on this, and that's Eddie Kendrick's "Keep on Trucking." There's this. It's not actually Norman Whitfield that's producing it, but you can see it was Frank Wilson. But you can see they're really trying to make it, the cinematic strings there. It's a better groove than it is a song, but it does sound modern. The rest, it doesn't sound. It's either for the kids, it's nostalgic, or it's kind of throwaway.
That's a bit harsh on Bob Dylan with not knocking on heaven's door, which is.
I'm just tired of buskers playing it when I was on the tube. If I hear it again, Man, take this badge off of me.
And there are different versions of it, obviously, but the one in the charts, just above or just below Eddie Kendricks, is Bob Dylan's version. How about for you, Dr. Peace? Anything stand out in these charts? I'll come on to the fourth thing that you've missed out very shortly, Tim.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, I wasn't alive at this time. I would emerge 3 years later, so I've got no immediate memories of all this. This is, I mean, I kind of had a look at the chart when I got sent it and looked back and thought, right, I recognise at least a couple of these songs. I've heard it on Planet Rock. I mean, I said last time that I was, very much of the kind of guitar swinging, rock kind of preferences. So I saw, there was a little bit of Status Quo there, with
Original.
Caroline.
Yeah,
Yeah, which is
think...
they were rocking those 3 chords very happily back in '73.
Yes, yep.
Had a look at the Nazareth song, "This Flight Tonight," which I think I'd heard before. But yeah, there's not there's not many of those that I think have kind of lasted the test of time into the rock sense. Anyway, there's a few. I was quite surprised to see Slade. I suppose they're practicing for the Christmas charts. A month early at that point.
Mate,
a Slade song there.
That is Chaz and Dave all over it, mate. And I think that My Friend Stan, which is, I think, one of the better tracks, is not typically Slade track, obviously, but I think that has both precedences because it's taking you to a sort of a music hall days of the great English, those were the days kind of era, but also it's looking forward because, like I say, Chaz and Dave picked up on this and they made a mint out of that sound and those type of songs for the rest of their career. I would agree with you that there ain't much of a rock thing going on
because they're all doing albums and they're not doing singles.
Well, maybe, but there is. I mean, Roxy Music's up there with Street Life.
That's different. I've never been able to understand them. I just don't understand what the concept is.
What I don't get is why you don't understand it, because if you go to number 5, one of your big heroes you've already mentioned here on this podcast.
Much more your hero than mine, Bowie.
Really?
Yeah, much more.
Oh, okay.
There's lots of things I don't. I think this is a dreadful version of a good song.
I don't think so at all.
I disagree.
Really, yeah. But I think what's happened here,
because you got to do it in a Liverpool accent with your long blonde hair. You don't say her. It's just not the racist for me, frankly.
I know. However, I don't know whether David Bowie is taken from what will become Brian Ferry as a solo artist, because he's given it the old white tux kind of mood about it. And I think it sounds very, very much like Roxy Music. But the rock, what has happened to rock and roll is that you hinted at it. It's been distilled into this sort of pop reimagining of rock and roll as pop. So where Alvin Stardust comes in, and I do remember this so vividly as well, by the way, because I would have.
Do you do Alvin Stardust impressions when you're on the tube, when you're standing up on a tube and you've got to hold the thing there the way that he held the microphone?
Well, hang on, he's nicked that off Gene Vincent. You have to go back to Gene Vincent and Bebop Lulu, because Gene Vincent had crashed his leg in a motorcycle accident in Norfolk, Virginia, when he was in the Navy there. His leg was in braces. One of his legs was in braces. And in those days, old school metal braces that kept your head down, defied gravity kind of thing. And he couldn't move his leg around. So he had to stand still. This is what Ian Dury picked up on. That's why Ian Dury's done Sweet Gene Vincent, because his was the equivalent of Gene Vincent authentically, because he had a gammy leg as well. And what Gene Vincent did was devise a style of performing rock and roll that was entirely unique. First of all, he went with the leathers because the leather was the only kind of trousers that he could use with those braces, with the braces underneath. So you had to have some strong, sturdy material. So once he did the leather trousers, he did the leather top, which made him a biker, which he was originally in any case. And he brought on the leather gloves as part of the look. So if you look at Gene Vincent circa 1960, where he's abandoned the United States, come over to Britain, because he came over and stayed for many years after or from the period when he and Eddie Cochran crashed in the car, which took Eddie Cochran's life. But at that point, he's transformed himself, because it was a shock to him as well, being in that accident, Sharon Shealy, who was Eddie Cochran's girlfriend, said they wouldn't have been driving that car if it wasn't for Gene Vincent. Gene Vincent was the biggest star in the UK. And she said, yeah, whatever Gene wanted, Gene got. So she wasn't very happy with him at all because she lost her boyfriend. Anyway, that's another look. So here comes Alvin Stardust, this Welsh guy out of nowhere. And I actually believed at 13 years old that his real name was Stardust, by the way, that Mr. and Mrs. Stardust were his parents. So
I was amazed when I found out that Tyrone Power was his real name.
Oh, was that
Imagine,
his real name?
yeah, imagine having that as a real name.
He's a great Hollywood actor. Nobody ever talks about Tyrone Power anymore. I think Tony Curtis took much of his stardom. And I interviewed Tony Curtis once at Harrods when he'd become a painter on the wrong end of his career, obviously, but he wasn't. He didn't look like the Tony Curtis that we knew that gave Tyrone Power a run for his money. But anyway, back to the chart. So Alvin Stardust is this guy who basically does the 1950s again, and he does it through this tune, which is part of the Chinny Chap, the dominant songwriters of the time, who are in the charts again with Mud, Dynamite at number 4, who are in the charts with Suzi Quatro, up there, and Alvin Stardust is part of that thing. If they didn't write it, then I apologize. It's within the same context. I don't know for certain that they wrote the Alvin Stardust. So that's one end of it. But what they represent to today's listeners is glam rock. And glam rock has done its year of fame in the limelight, probably 72, 73. Maybe beginning of 73 to the end of 73. At this point, glam rock is running out of ideas. So you see the people that associate with glam rocks, people like Mark Bolan and T-Rex in the charts with a tune that ain't anything like T-Rex, Mark Bolan. Suddenly they're going on a different tangent. They're running out of ideas here. They can't keep the glam rock thing going. My friend Stan by Slade, who were the epitome of glam rock. They're probably the most successful glam rock crew. I think it's an older song by them. But anyway, the fact that it's in the charts at this moment is also saying, look, they're running out of ideas. They've used the echo as much as they can on all their big hit songs. So at this point, they're just trying to find anything that will keep them in the charts. And they've done that quite well. David Essex is the one that I think is the biggest casualty of this harking back to rock and roll, because he actually is quite an original artist. I think with Lamplight here, it's not my favorite David Essex, but it's probably within the top 3.
Quite dramatic, isn't it? Lamplight.
It is, and it's unusual.
Yeah.
It's like looking at Johnny Kidd and the Pirates and thinking, well, what other rock and roll song have I ever heard like that? Shaking all over. You haven't heard anything like that because nothing else had the guitar shaking all over, etc. And I agree with that with Lamplight. So the fourth thing I was going to say at this point is it's the end, or we're coming to the end of glam rock. It'll probably squeeze another year out of itself, but really you've lost the essence of glam rock here, and it's given the likes of David Cassidy a look in again where they should have had a look in, and the likes of Gilbert O'Sullivan, Lindsay DePaul's in there, Kiki D's in there, all with sort of I suppose pop tracks that they probably would have done better if they just waited this period out and let it rule itself out.
If you look at this chart, you have no idea that there's all kinds of turmoil in the world. There's no idea of...
Although 2 versions of Deck of Cards, Deck of Cards being that sort of spiritual determinist look at life. When I see the ace, it reminds me there is one card. And you've got the sort of more humorous, not humorous actually, because it's quite serious, but once you say Max Bygraves, all you're thinking of is, I want to tell you a story, and it's about a deck of cards, and Wink Martindale's also in that chart. So I think there is a little bit of spirituality going on, because I can't see why there would be 2 versions of that in the charts at the same time, unless it did resonate in one way or another, unless the same people are buying 2 copies. And like I say, Knocking on Heaven's Door, Bob Dylan, I think seals that.
If there were people buying 2 versions of Deck of Cards, then I want their names and addresses, because I've got a bridge in London that I can sell to them.
How do you explain Laughing Gnome by David Bowie? Any explanations?
Well, it's in the late 50s, early 60s tradition of great British novelty records, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah. But how do you explain it? David Bowie we're talking about.
I don't know. He's never been my thing. I've never understood
Okay.
him.
Okay. And just on your final point, just on the great version of Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, another Bob Dylan track by Brian Ferry. They kind of did a very different thing to him. It's difficult to choose between them actually, because they're two different works of art, I think, dealing with the same song. But just on the note, when you say that we've forgotten or we're not even thinking about what's going on the other side of the world, when it comes to Vietnam, we are, because number 40, Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree, featuring Tony Orlando and Dawn. Basically, it's Dawn, and I don't know who Tony Orlando is, but he owns the rights to it. That, of course, was the sentiment of Americans to those soldiers, conscripts who were fighting in Vietnam. So they tied a yellow. I didn't know that at that time. It just sounded like a stupid little ditty. But once you know that, it does give it a little bit more weight than you would otherwise
I didn't know that.
it to be.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Because they did that as a tradition. They tied, in these small towns around America, they tied a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree, usually outside the house or around any tree outside the house of the people whose son invariably had been sent out to Vietnam to die. So
It's
they
amazing. I
tied
think the thing you're saying like that, it's what's really weird, and go back to when Tim was talking about what was being listened to in Chile, with Victor Jara and these other people. It just reminded me of Leonardo Vélez, the left wing footballer for Chile and Colo Colo. And he said one of the things he said that he used to take some of the kind of the disproved songs against the Pinochet regime, like Victor Jara, or I think it was Inti Illimani or Kia Pun, who were, these kind of pan-pipe protest singers. This is what people were listening to in Chile. These kind of, people with very Chilean costumes and ponchos and playing traditional Chilean instrument. And that's the songs that a footballer, a fashionable, socially aware footballer is listening, hiding in his luggage when he's going to these games. And we've got at the same time we've got Slade and Mud and Mott the Hoople and thing. I mean, it just kind of says just how far apart the world was at that time. I mean, I think it's if we looked at kind of what Chilean footballers are listening to on their journeys from Valparaiso to Santiago down to Temuco, they probably will be listening to the same kind of things as the lads on the the Saint Southampton bus or the Liverpool plane. They probably are listening to the same thing now. So I think that it does just show what is going on in Chile, what they're listening to. It's amazing.
As Dotun has said, we've turned the world into a big airport lounge in terms of music. As everyone listening to the same handful of stars. The thing that's always sorry, just quickly. The thing that's always struck me about that Chilean music is how forced it is to kind of create a rural vibe. I know that by the end, Victor Jara was thinking of how can we urbanize this? How can we stop it being kind of folk music and make it something dynamic? But a lot of this Chilean pipe music, it's seen it as quite a forced attempt to go in search of rural roots. A little bit like the rock stars going to the country to get their heads together, only with less drugs.
There's an amazing thing about art is that it is so universal. It's part of the human condition. And when we think that art is asleep, it's actually very much alive in all of us to some extent, but it just hasn't been given the air to express itself.
It's like Cesar Luis Minotti, the great coach, says about great players. If they're not doing anything on the field, if they're just standing still, doesn't mean they're asleep. They're thinking.
You're 100% right in that comparison then, because let's not forget, before we sort of start saying, well, this Chilean music, this pipe music, Tim doesn't like it, so therefore it's not relevant. Remember that
it's not relevant to me.
I'm only kidding. That was a joke.
That's the relevant in the room, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's relevant in the room. That's a good point. Because Simon and Garfunkel, they're hearing it and they're thinking, I'd rather be a hammer than a nail. Yes, I would, if I only could. And you can see how what comes out of folk struggle is turned into a universal anthem that, replicates when the Negro spiritual turned into gospel. And we don't think, we don't look today and think, ooh, what were they doing, the Negro spiritual? Some of those Negro spirituals were powerful, but when you just listen to them, wade in the water, wade in the water, children. It's only when you realize that that was a signal to escape from your enslavement that the song resonates. I would never dismiss folk music. I would never dismiss it. And I think what you've both said, actually, probably some, sheep herder or some shepherd in the Andean mountains was saying exactly the same thing, but coalescing it in a song.
Does that mean that we should end this podcast by putting our fingers in our ear and say, "We're leaving Liverpool, never to return"?
Yeah, you can too. I've read the Valparaiso Journey, whatever it was called, the Irish version of it. In any case, guys, what a pleasure. Would you rather be a hammer than a nail? Just going around the table, Tim.
Oh hell yeah, yeah.
Hammer than a nail? You sure?
Yeah,
sure?
Yeah.
You'd rather just whack it in than nail it.
There's part of me which is an iron. I think there's a little bit of me that is an iron. Okay. Only just a little bit.
Dr. Pete,
I've had concussion before, so I'd prefer not to be whacked on the head again. So
fair point. I just thought being a nail would be the more precise point at bringing the conversation to.
I'd want to be the wood. I reckon.
Yeah, it gets bored though. I tried. Great, absolute pleasure speaking. No, don't need to shake your head, Tommy. Oh, come on, it wasn't that bad. I had to think about it at all. Anyway, you see the madness that this podcast descends into every time. Pete, it's been an absolute pleasure, mate.
Cheers.
No, cheers. Great to be back. Lovely to see you guys, and great discussion about things that happened 50 years ago, which I think we should really remember. So thanks for the opportunity.
Well,